Okay, today we're going to be talking about Yupo paper, which is a paper alternative, supposedly. Comes in these plastic sheets, looks like paper, does not feel like paper, and it's something that I don't know if anyone really uses, honestly. The whole idea behind it is supposed to be that it's recycled, so you're using less trees and whatnot. So it's made from polypropylene pellets, which, as far as I know, in order to get polypropylene, you still have to extract it from oils. But if they're claiming it's recycled, I wonder how much of it actually is recycled and how much of it is just like new plastics. You know, because if you're gonna be making paper like this stark white, or like a thin material this stark white, probably gonna have to do some new refining. If you're just using recycled plastics, it's coming in all different shades. Either way, I decided I was going to make a sketchbook out of one to try it. I had initially intended to fill this sketchbook, but it did not quite pan out because, well, you'll see, I guess. So I started out with pencils because they seem like kind of the default art supply. Is that fair to say? I don't know. I figure everybody's got pencils in their art supply collection rolling around. And I must say that pencils on this material are very nice. Sure, they smudge a lot, but they also erase fairly easy as long as you're using a plastic eraser or even a kneaded eraser. And it feels really good to write on this surface with it. It's nice and smooth. It's like using butter, you know? Which I guess you could use butter on this too, but probably shouldn't. Either way though, I ended up testing a few different thicknesses. I had some HB, some 6H, some 2Bs, some 5Bs. I don't know, I just had a bunch of different types of pencils, as well as colored pencils to see how those would do on here. And kind of the same thing. I think the quality of your colored pencil is definitely going to affect it a little bit. Mine were just like very cheap watercolor pencils that I've had kicking around in a drawer forever, because I mean, I really don't use colored pencils that often. But either way, they did do really nice on here. However, I would recommend sealing this once you're done with it, because it will smudge with just like a finger's touch. Okay, and the next thing to try out would be watercolors, which I know this is pencil right now, but it's just a sketch. Don't get ahead of yourself, you know. But yeah, watercolors on this are not quite as smooth and buttery as the colored and regular pencils, which is unfortunate because I was starting this sketch with the colored pencils. I was really optimistic. I was really looking forward to, you know, I had my photo reference down. I was going to make a nice watercolor. I had to clean out my color pan first because I haven't washed that thing in God knows how long, but I was ready to go, and I was excited, needless to say. But reality would unfortunately come crashing down upon mixing all my colors, because it turns out Yupo and watercolor are not the greatest mix if you're trying to be precise. What happens is that the watercolor just want to run to the lowest point because it is plastic and there's no grit to it, because it's a completely smooth material and there's no porousness or whatever. It just lies on top. It's not going to actually grab onto anything. It's just going to sit there and run to wherever gravity takes it, essentially. So despite the fact that I did maybe like 15 passes, not 15, but you know, like 7 or 8 passes with these watercolors trying to get it nice and smooth, I just simply never could. And I'm wondering if the best way to do it is honestly just to do it one very thin layer at a time and build up like 20 to 25 layers. Although now that I'm thinking about it, whenever I would go back in to work over top of the watercolors, it would just reactivate the stuff underneath, which again has to do with the porousness of the material. When you're working on regular paper, the watercolor actually soaks into it, so you can go over it with other watercolors without disturbing your previous layer. On this stuff though, it's just plastic. Polypropylene plastic, to be precise, and so it's just going to keep reactivating. It's the same as if you have it in your plastic pan. So after a while, I kind of just had to give up and erase it. I took a paper towel, and I mean, luckily it erased well enough. Very little of it actually stayed behind on the paper, and I figured this was as good a time as any to try out the gouache on here, which is another test I was going to do, although I had intended to do it on another piece of paper, but I realized that maybe it was the only thing that could do the sky on here. So anyways, I mixed up my gouache. I use some kind of brand. I don't know. I was going to tell you the brand. I don't know what it is, though. And yeah, it worked better, but not great. And by this point, I was starting to wonder if maybe some of the spray I had used on the other page was getting onto this page, and that's why my watercolor didn't want to, like, go to certain areas. So I ended up sanding it and then putting a weight on it so that it wouldn't just run to the outside. And you can see at the bottom here, it still turned out weird and clumpy. I think that may have been it. I think some overspray may have gotten onto there despite the fact that I masked it. But even on the spots where it was working normally and it wasn't clumping up, I just couldn't get a smooth finish. I just couldn't get that finish I wanted. I think that this would probably be a good material if you're doing like abstract watercolors where you don't care so much about precise location, you know what I mean? But trying to do like a scene or something on here is just a nightmare. And after a while, I just completely gave up and moved on to Sharpies, which everybody's got Sharpies. Everybody likes Sharpies. And this is by far probably my favorite material aside from pencils. I know I said pencil was my favorite material, but Sharpie's probably one of my second favorite materials on here just because it feels right. I mean, it feels like working on like a whiteboard or something almost, but with more permanence. Like when you draw on the whiteboard with Sharpie and your teacher would yell at you, something like that. It worked. It was smooth. It was exactly the feedback I was looking for, and most of all, it really didn't smudge when you put your finger across it, which is nice. Although later on, it did kind of bleed onto the page next to it, so I'm almost wondering if you have to seal these also, but truth be told, I'm not sure how you would seal an alcohol-based marker. But anyways, with that side done, I was able to move on to the graffiti mop, which was just kind of something I wanted to test out. I made this graffiti mop juice a long time ago. I don't remember what all was in it. It's like alcohol, pen, ink refills, and I think like brake fluid? I don't know. Look it up. Don't take my word for it. And anyways, it went on kind of nice, but then as time went on, it just kind of ran around and like leveled out. It never quite dried on here, and I'm not sure if that's just due to the material or if that's due to the graffiti mop itself, because I've put it on other things before and it's dried just fine. But anyways, I ended up christening it with a little Sharpie here at the end and called it a day. After that, I moved on to working on ink stuff, which for the first one, I just tried one of the Precise V2, V5 pocket pens. I don't know. They're a nice pen. They run around nice. They feel nice on this material, but they have this problem where even after drying for hours and hours, if you try to put your finger on it or something else, it'll leave an imprint of it. So I moved on to a calligraphy ink instead with a fountain pen to see if maybe this stuff would work a little bit better. Probably could have used a better ink for this fountain pen, but I wanted to see what just like a basic non-waterproof cheap ink would do on it. And it kind of reacted similar to a watercolor where gravity kind of pulled all the pigment to one side. So you'd end up with like a weird like transparency on top and dark on bottom. Then I tried this pocket brush, and I wanted to see how well it would wipe off with rubbing alcohol, and it didn't really. It seems like, if anything, the rubbing alcohol may have melted the polypropylene a little bit, and even after that, when I put the pocket brush on there, it didn't dry properly. It stayed sticky and tacky forever. It was like, even after like walking away from it overnight, it stayed tacky. I just don't think this material has the porousness needed for something like a pocket brush or ink washes. Probably have to give it a long time to dry properly. But after that, I decided I was going to try some more traditional inking using a crow quill nib and some carbon black ink, which is one of my favorite inks. You can go over it with just about anything. You can see here I messed up, and upon trying to clean it up, I found that it was just as forgiving as paper. In other words, you can't clean it up if you mess up with this type of ink. Probably with any type of ink, honestly. It leaves a weird stain on there, and there's just no going back, really. But I did like how this felt on there. The crow quill nib, it felt nice, just kind of gliding across it. Definitely different from paper. You don't get that same scratchy feedback that you would. But not my favorite material by far. The Pigma Micron was up next. This is kind of the standard pen that everybody goes with, I feel like. It's good for Copic markers. It's good for watercolors. It's archival quality. It's just good. It comes in a bunch of different colors, bunch of different sizes. After that, I wanted to try this Black 2 Deleter pen ink, which is also good for Copic markers. I don't think it's waterproof, but it works well with alcohol-based markers, which is the whole reason I wanted to test it. Because in a moment here, we're going to try out some of those markers. So it was time for the Copic markers, which are not awful on this material. Really, all the markers I tried on here kind of were streaky. It only really worked with Sharpies, I think, because I was doing it in short little lines instead of trying to fill in massive areas. But yeah, they kind of lifted up the ink that normally would hold them, and they didn't really fill a solid color. Again, there's no porousness to this material. I'm sure it's fine for something, but like probably not for all materials. Oh, also when I tried to erase here, pulled up most of the ink, whereas that wouldn't happen on a piece of paper where it has more time to dry. I moved on to acrylic paints for one of the final tests because acrylic paints are one of the things I like to work with personally. I could have tried oil paints on here, though I didn't really have time to wait 3 weeks for this stuff to dry. Because I finished recording this yesterday, and I'm finishing recording the audio today. That's movie magic for you. Anyways, I just tried out a bunch of different cheap paints that I had lying around to see how it would do on here, and I smeared them around, and sure enough, yeah, it's acrylic paint. You're putting plastic-based material onto plastic. It adheres well enough. It's like working with a smooth canvas, which kind of begs the question, why not just get a canvas? And this is kind of where I see Yupo having an advantage, because it already has that smooth surface. And unlike something that's porous, it's not going to buckle as you add more wetness to it. It's just going to stay smooth, nice and crisp. It will curl if you add enough paint over top of it, but for the most part, it's actually a really good material for acrylic paint. You don't have to prime canvases or wait for the gesso to dry, all that fun stuff. And at this point, it was time to draw a crab because it just felt right, I've been waiting a long time to draw this crab, and I figured now was the time to do it. Why not properly christen this sketchbook? So started out with pencil again with nice material on here. Don't let it smudge. It will smudge. And did some acrylics and a little more detail. And here's where I started to notice that when you're trying to paint with a little more detail, you're probably going to want like a heavy body acrylic, because due to that smoothness, it doesn't lay down in even coats. These are higher quality paints I was using too. These are my good ones, and yeah, they just didn't want to lay down in an even coat. It ended up kind of splotchy, which is not the worst thing. That's a stylistic choice to some degree, but wasn't exactly what I was going for. And it definitely took a lot of going over it again and again to get the look that I wanted. Whereas with, a normal surface, if I was going over it with acrylics, I would just have to lay down my color and call it a day. Again, there's no porousness to this material, which is my biggest complaint with it, I would say. And it's probably why I unfortunately won't use it again anytime soon. Oh, and I did also try out like the cheap paints on here, and they worked out fine enough, I suppose. It's Apple Barrel. It's like Walmart paint, It's not great. It's not really meant to be great. It's meant to be inexpensive. And if you put enough layers on here, it probably worked fine. I also put some Posca pens on here, which were good, They're Posca pens. They don't exactly dry indestructible. You'd have to clear coat them, but it's not the end of the world. Oh, and I do recommend putting a paper towel in between the sheets. Lastly, I had crayons, which I did not steal from a Buffalo Wild Wings. They were given to me by someone on the inside. Anyways, crayons are not terrible on this surface, although I will say Crayolas, these are not. I think that these crayons may be a little old or maybe a little cheap. I mean, they're made from wax, so I had assumed they would all be fine, but you can see they left chunks on here, And I did end up trying different crayons on here. I even tried the name brand, the fancy Crayolas, and same deal. I think just the smoothness of it didn't work out super well, but I did my due diligence and I filled out the page before moving on to crayons that are a little bit nicer, given to me by Marlon from the podcast, which you all know and love Marlon. These things are no joke. I think they're technically labeled as like wax pens or something, but I like them. I like them a lot. These things are like writing with hot butter. They just melt right onto your finger. They melt right onto the page. This is how a crayon should be. And so for the remainder of this video, I used these things. Look at how nice they are. Look at how smooth. This ended up being one of my third favorite materials to put on here, just because they were so smooth. So smooth, in fact, that I couldn't help just doing one page, and I had to actually move on to a second page to try something else out, which I did, I would say, with pretty good success. I think maybe more so than liking Yupo, I just like these things, and I like having them on a smooth surface, so whether that's like a primed canvas or just like a hot press paper of some kind, I don't think it would really affect it either way. I don't know if Yupo is the paper of choice, is what I'm saying. My final conclusion on Yupo, in fact, is that it's kind of expensive for something that, while probably partially recycled, is probably not 100% recycled, and is probably not really, in the end, any better for the environment than just normal paper. And it definitely doesn't have the quality of normal paper, so I can't exactly recommend switching over to it. I could be entirely wrong. It could be 100% recycled, but that doesn't change the fact that it is not paper. And until they make one with some kind of tooth to it or some kind of absorbency, which is impossible for this material, I don't see myself using it. But anyways, that was my in-depth review of Yupo paper. I hope that you all enjoyed it. I'm going to finish editing this and go to bed. No, I'm going to go back to work. All right. Bye.